This is the Tower. And for many people familiar with tarot, it is one of the most feared cards in the deck. Lightning striking a structure, fire, collapse, people falling, everything unstable, all at once. Because of that imagery, many people interpret the Tower as something bad, a warning, a punishment, a sign that everything is about to fall apart. But over time, I've realized that the Tower doesn't always mean what most people think it means. Because sometimes what collapses was never as stable as it appeared. And sometimes the Tower does not arrive to destroy your life. Sometimes it interrupts the version of life you were trying to force yourself to continue living. You're listening to The Occult and the Apocalypse, where we explore the hidden and the revealed through patterns, symbolism, and awareness. Not to predict, but to notice, and not to conclude, but to understand. A few years ago, I was in a season of my life where on the surface, things appeared stable. I had already gone through my divorce. I had already started rebuilding. I was dating again. I had a career that looked successful on the outside. I was working in a position that I have fought very hard to reach, and in many ways, it felt like things were finally settling down. My company was planning for the future. We were traveling a lot for work, talking long term, trying to build. And then suddenly, very suddenly, everything changed. My company announced layoffs, and within less than 3 weeks, I found out that I would no longer have a job. At almost the same time, there were disruptions happening in other areas of my life too. Relationship instability, distance with close connections, questions about my future, questions about my long-term stability, questions about who I even was outside of my structure I had built my life around. And what made it so destabilizing was not only the loss itself, it was the speed of it. Things were good, things were good, things were good, and then suddenly they weren't. It felt like the floor dropped out all at once. And yet, underneath the panic and uncertainty, there was another feeling too. One that honestly confused me at first. Relief. Not because I wanted my life to collapse, not because I enjoyed uncertainty, but because some deeper part of me already knew how much pressure I had been living under long before anything visibly fell apart. And I think many people experience Tower moments this way, not as an external collapse, but as the sudden exposure of tension, instability, exhaustion, or misalignment that had already been quietly building beneath the surface for a long time. And when something collapses that quickly, the first instinct is often to focus on the visible moment, the layoff, the breakup, the loss, the sudden change, the moment that everything finally becomes undeniable. But looking back now, I can see that the collapse had not actually started the day that I lost my job. The pressure had been building long before that. At work, there were already signs that things were becoming unstable beneath the surface. People were burning out. Several employees had taken leaves of abscess due to stress. Projects that should have been manageable constantly felt like emergencies. Everything was urgent. Everything was a fire. Meetings stretched for hours trying to solve problems that never seemed fully resolved. Deadlines were missed. Expectations kept increasing. And even though I cared deeply about what I was doing, I could feel that something inside the structure was becoming unsustainable. There were moments where it became clear that the company was shifting directions in ways that no longer fully aligned with what I had initially planned to be building. And I think some part of me already knew that eventually something was going to give. Not necessarily consciously, but quietly. Like tension accumulating underneath something that still appeared stable from the outside. And later, I realized that this pattern existed more than just my work life. I had normalized pressure in almost every area of my life. Emotional overfunctioning, exhaustion, constant responsibility, survival mode. I had spent so much of my life working hard, proving myself, solving problems, staying needed, staying useful, staying productive, that I stopped questioning whether the pace I was living at was actually healthy. I had worked consistently since I was 14 years old, sometimes multiple jobs at once. And over time, I built an identity around endurance, around being capable, around surviving pressure. But humans are remarkably good at confusing familiar with stable. And sometimes we stay inside unsustainable structures, not because they're healthy, but because they're familiar. Because we've adapted to the pressure. Because we've learned how to function inside the instability. Because survival itself starts feeling normal. And I think many people are living this way without fully realizing how much tension they've normalized. Not only in work, but in relationships, in routines, in emotional patterns, in systems that quietly demand more and more from people while giving less stability in return. Sometimes the tower does not arrive as a random interruption. Sometimes it reveals pressures that have been accumulating beneath the surface for a very long time. And maybe that's part of why the Tower card has frightened people for so long. Because people do not want collapse. Most people don't want disruption. We want stability, predictability, security. We want to believe that the structures we've built our lives around will continue holding. And when something suddenly falls apart, the first instinct is often to ask, why is this happening to me? What did I do wrong? How did I not see this coming? But symbolically, the tower has often represented something deeper than punishment. In many interpretations, the lightning striking the tower is not only destruction, it's revelation, sudden awareness, the collapse of something that could no longer sustain itself in its form. And I think that changes the way we experience disruption. Because if collapse is only meaningless destruction, then all that remains afterwards is fear. But if collapse can sometimes expose what was already unstable, then the experience becomes more complicated, more painful in some ways, but also more clarifying. Sometimes the tower reveals that we were exhausted long before we admitted it. Sometimes it reveals relationships that were already cracking underneath the surface. Sometimes it reveals identities built entirely around survival, performance, achievement, or external validation. And sometimes the most destabilizing part is realizing how long we ignored what some deeper part of us already knew. Not because we were stupid and not because we failed, but because humans are incredibly capable of adapting to pressure while convincing ourselves that adaptation is the same thing as alignment. And I don't think the tower appears in life because the universe enjoys destroying people. I think sometimes the tower interrupts structures that we would have continued forcing ourselves to survive inside indefinitely. Structures that may have looked stable externally, while quietly disconnecting us from ourselves internally. And maybe that's why so many people describe tower moments with contradictions. Grief and relief, fear and freedom, loss and clarity existing at the same time. Because when a structure collapses, it doesn't only remove something, sometimes it also exposes something. Something hidden underneath the performance, underneath the exhaustion, underneath the survival mode, underneath the version of life we were trying so hard to maintain. And for me, one of the most uncomfortable parts of the collapse was realizing how much of my identity had been tied to being successful and how I was defining that, to being productive, to being needed, to being capable. I had spent so much of my life working towards stability that I stopped asking whether the version of success I had built actually felt aligned with the life I wanted to live. And when the job disappeared, it forced me to confront questions I had been avoiding for a very long time. Who was I outside of my productivity, outside of achievement, outside of constantly proving my value through work? Because when something we've built our identity around suddenly disappears, it can feel like we disappear with it. And at first, the empty space that followed felt deeply uncomfortable, not only financially, but emotionally. I didn't fully know what to do with myself without constant pressure driving me forward all the time. And yet, underneath the discomfort, something else slowly started happening too. I began noticing how much of my life had been organized around survival mode. How disconnected I had come from my own exhaustion. How much of myself I had sacrificed trying to maintain structures that looked successful externally. And one of the hardest realizations was understanding that somewhere along the way, I had started believing that overworking myself was proof that I was being a good mother. I wanted my children to see me as successful, capable, responsible. I thought I was modeling strength. But in reality, I had become emotionally absent in ways that I didn't fully recognize while inside the pressure. And that realization hurt because deep down, long before career titles or achievement, what I had always truly wanted was to be present, to be connected, to build a life that actually felt meaningful. And strangely, even though losing my job destabilized my external security, it also removed an enormous amount of pressure from my nervous system almost immediately. Even during periods where I genuinely did not know what would happen next financially, I felt less emotionally trapped, less compressed, less consumed by constant urgency. And around that same time, something else became clear to me too. Before the layoff had even happened, I had already started quietly building something on the side. I had started my branding on my other platform. I opened myself up to doing tarot readings. And at the time, I didn't fully understand why I felt so drawn toward it. And it didn't entirely make logical sense yet. But afterward, I realized that what I had begun building ended up helping add some financial support during the collapse. And it gave me something to focus on. And that experience changed the way I think about intuition. Because sometimes intuition leads us towards preparation before we consciously understand what we are preparing for. Sometimes some deeper part of us recognizes that change is coming long before the conscious mind fully catches up. And looking back now, I don't think the collapse only removed things from my life. I think it also forced me to reconnect with parts of myself that had been buried underneath performance, exhaustion, survival, and external expectations for a very long time. And when I started looking at my own life this way, it became difficult not to notice similar patterns happening collectively, too. Because I don't think many people right now are only experiencing individual tower moments. I think entire systems, institutions, expectations, and definitions of success are being questioned in ways that they weren't before. People are burnt out. They are exhausted and disconnected. Many are working harder than ever while feeling less stable than previous generations did. Trust in institutions has weakened. Community structure have weakened. Dating culture has become increasingly destabilized for many people. And across a lot of society, there seems to be a growing sense of something about the way we've been living is no longer fully sustainable. Not only economically, but emotionally, spiritually, and relationally. And when collective pressure builds long enough, people often begin reevaluating things they once accepted automatically. What actually matters? What kind of life feels meaningful? What sacrifices are no longer worth making? What definitions of success are no longer feeling aligned? And I think that that's part of why so many people right now seem drawn towards things like slower living, nervous system healing, spirituality, intentional community, authenticity, rebuilding local support systems, reconnecting with nature, or trying to create lives that feel more emotionally sustainable. Not necessarily because humanity is collapsing, but because pressure often forces reevaluation, the same way it does individually. And throughout history, periods of disruption have often preceded periods of questioning, rebuilding, spiritual searching, philosophical shifts, and changes in collective values. Not because suffering automatically creates wisdom, but because disruption interrupts unconscious momentum. It forces people to stop, to reevaluate, to notice tensions that had previously been normalized. And maybe that's part of why collective tower moments can feel so disorienting while we're inside them. Because when old structures begin destabilizing before new structures have fully formed, people often experience uncertainty, polarization, searching, fear, but also possibility. Because sometimes destabilization creates space for people to begin imagining different ways of living, connecting, building, and defining meaning altogether. And I think that's one of the hardest parts about the tower moments. When you're inside them, they rarely feel meaningful at first. They feel disorienting, painful, uncertain. And sometimes the only thing you can see clearly in the moment is what's falling apart. But looking back now, I can also see that the collapse forced me to reevaluate things that I may have never questioned otherwise. What did I actually want my life to feel like? What kind of success was worth sacrificing myself for? What kind of work environment felt healthy? What kind of pace was sustainable? What did I want my children to remember about me? And slowly over time, I began rebuilding differently. Not perfectly, and not all at once, but more consciously. I became more intentional about the kind of work I accepted, more protective of my peace, more aware of what constant pressure was doing to my nervous system, my relationships, and my ability to actually be present inside my own life. And even though parts of the collapse were genuinely painful, I can also honestly say that I would not fully return to the version of myself that existed before it. Because underneath the exhaustion, achievement, overworking, and survival mode, I had quietly drifted away from myself. And the collapse forced me to see that. Not because I was being punished and not because I had failed, but because sometimes structures that once helped us to survive eventually become structures we continue maintaining long after they stop supporting who we are becoming. And maybe that's why tower moments can feel both devastating and strangely freeing at the same time. Because sometimes what collapses is not your entire life. Sometimes it's the version of life you were forcing yourself to survive inside. And maybe that changes the way we experience disruption itself. Because instead of only asking, why is this happening? We may eventually begin asking, what is this interruption revealing, and what can no longer continue the same way? What kind of life is trying to emerge underneath the collapse? And maybe those questions do not remove grief or uncertainty or fear, but perhaps they create enough space for us to move through destabilization with a little less shame and a little more hope and awareness. So if you're inside a tower moment right now, if something in your life feels like it's collapsing or destabilizing or being forced to change, maybe the question is not only what is falling apart, maybe the deeper question is what inside of me or inside of my life can no longer continue the same way. I did create a small workbook on moving through changes. My link is in the description. But otherwise, what if the collapse is not only ending something, but also making space for something more honest to begin? But I'll leave that for you to think about. Thank you for being here with me and helping me take the occult and the apocalypse and see it as just the hidden and the revealed. Come back next week. We're going to go through symbols and what they've meant throughout time. I'll see you there.